生男孩了就是个大喜了，就是生女孩了就是小喜吧，也不能学成不喜，就是大小喜。生了男孩以后就是学在咱们这个家里了，要是生了女孩嘞，就是出家嘞啊，不在咱们这个家。孙子跟孙女儿2个，那个是个大喜，这个是个小喜。
大家现在看到的画面拍摄于1983年的秋天，在秦岭深处的张庄村，人们正忙着秋收。这是一片被岁月拉得很长的土地，千百年来，这里的人一直过着日出而作、日入而息的日子。在金黄的玉米穗与斑驳的土墙之间，流淌着普通人最真实也最隐秘的一生。边缘纪录片今天要讲的故事就发生在这里，它没有惊天动地的戏剧冲突，却藏着几代农村女人最隐秘、最沉重的一生。当我们在40多年后重新凝视这些镜头，才终于读懂了她们无声的挣扎与温柔的力量。你敢信吗？在旧中国那段沉闷压抑的岁月里，一个结了婚的农村女人连拥有自己名字的资格都没有。在娘家，她只是谁家的闺女，一旦嫁入婆家，就立刻变成了某某家的媳妇儿。就连丈夫对外提起她，也只会说一句我家里的，听着带着烟火气。可细品之下，不过是在昭告一件私有财产的归属权。而更让人脊背发凉的是，如果村里人私下嚼舌根，说一个女人一辈子没孩子，千万别以为她真的不能生育。在那个宗族观念刻进骨子里的年代，这句话的潜台词只有一个：她没生出儿子。在这套延续了几千年的封建父权秩序里，女儿养得再好，终究是要泼出去的水，拱手嫁到别人家。只有儿子才配得上开门续香火的名头，才是继承家业、赡养父母的正根。也正因如此，一个女人在村里的地位和命运从来不由她自己决定，甚至不由她生了多少孩子决定，只看她有没有生出儿子。而这副看不见的枷锁，从他们咕咕坠地的那一刻起，就已经像一张密不透风的大网，牢牢罩住了他们的一生。就中国几百年来的几代农村女性，就这样在这张网里开始了一场漫长、沉默又无人倾听的挣扎。而这张密不透风的网，曾罩住了旧中国几百年来一代又一代的农村女人，成了她们刻进骨头里的宿命。在传统农耕社会里，父系宗族就是最高的秩序，所有的资源和权力都只沿着男性血脉单向流动，族谱上只写男人的名字，祖先牌位只能由儿子供奉，土地、房屋这些安身立命的家底儿也只会一辈辈传给儿子。在很多地方，生儿子被叫做开门留根，意思是只有儿子才能把这个家的香火续下去，而女人从始至终都只是这个体系里的外人和附属品。从她出生的那天起，人生剧本就已经被写死了，长大、嫁人、给别人家当媳妇儿、生孩子。在娘家，她是迟早要走的泼出去的水；在婆家，她是背负着传宗接代任务的外来人。本以为随着时代的车轮滚滚向前，这张网会被彻底撕碎，可在距离北京600公里的张庄村，我们却看到时代的风吹得动土墙，吹得动庄稼，却吹不动刻在人心里的旧观念。虽然越来越多的女孩开始上学、进城打工，甚至能自己选对象，但那些扎根在婚姻和血缘里的规矩，比修一条公路、盖一座工厂要顽固得多。几代人的努力也只能在上面磨出一道浅浅的划痕，新与旧的拉扯、妥协和阵痛还在悄无声息地继续。正是在这种新旧观念最激烈碰撞的时刻，1971年，一个出生在北京、长在北京的美国学者第一次走进了这个封闭的村庄。那时候的中国农村几乎与外界隔绝，很多村民一辈子没出过县城，而女人们的世界更是只有锅台、田地和村口的那条小巷。在此后的半个多世纪里，她几十次重返张庄，像一个安静的旁观者，用最平实的镜头和文字记录下了这里3代女性的真实人生。她们有人经历过包办婚姻的无奈，有人尝过重男轻女的苦涩，有人见证了集体劳动的火热，也有人扛过了计划生育的重压，最终迎来了改革开放的春风。她们的故事里没有帝王将相，没有惊天动地的大事，却像一面最干净的镜子，照出了中国农村社会半个多世纪的变迁。而在这个新旧交替的十字路口，一个叫灵巧的女孩 第一个站到了风口浪尖。他是村里少有的高中毕业生，读书给了他不一样的眼界，也给了他一件在当时极其奢侈的东西——自由恋爱的权利。在高中校园里，他和同村的男孩明权相爱了。可在那个抬头不见低头见的熟人社会里，哪怕是最纯粹的校园爱情，一旦走出校门，也立刻变成了全村人茶余饭后的谈资。在一片窃窃私语中，灵巧和明权还是订了婚。在那个年代，年轻人虽然有了一点选择的苗头，但这点自由必须严丝合缝地套在传统的框框里。在村里人看来，订婚就是板上钉钉的事，只有订了婚，两人才算名正言顺，可以光明正大的见面了解。理论上，如果觉得不合适也可以退婚，但现实远比理论残酷。在一个宗族关系盘根错节的村子里，退婚从来不是两个人的私事，而是两个家族的脸面。流言蜚语会像潮水一样把人淹没，所有人都会追着问，当初为什么答应，现在为什么反悔？这种无形的唾沫星子和舆论压力，比那张纸做的婚约要重得多。可即便头顶着这样的规矩，灵巧也已经足够幸运了。至少在掀开命运的底牌之前，他真真切切地爱过，选择过。而如果把时间再往前推几十年，对于他的母亲、奶奶那一代人来说，婚姻这两个字跟他们自己没有半点关系。从村里几位老人断断续续的回忆里，一个冰冷到刺骨的世界慢慢浮现。那是一个父母之命、媒妁之言大过天的时代。很多女孩还没有灶台高，还不知道男女之事是什么，两家人的长辈就已经在旱烟袋的烟雾里把他们的终身大事定了下来。媒婆上门谈的永远是彩礼、嫁妆、家境，从头到尾不会问那个即将出嫁的女孩一句愿不愿意。很多女人直到多年以后，才在大人们的闲聊中惊觉，原来自己这辈子的命运早在当年的某张土炕上被几句轻飘飘的话就彻底安排好了。这哪里是结婚，分明是一场全凭运气的盲盒抽奖。不少老人回忆起当年提亲的场景，最深的感受只有4个字：全程失语。在长辈们眼里，小孩子哪懂什么婚姻大事，更何况是女孩子，连坐在旁边旁听的资格都没有。只要两家人觉得门当户对，家境相当，知根知底，一顿饭的功夫，这桩长达几十年的婚事就彻底定死了。至于那个要跟人过一辈子的女孩愿不愿意，以后会不会幸福，在利益和规矩面前从来都不值一提。更荒唐的是，有些婚事的起点随意的像个玩笑，两个母亲在田里干活，直起腰擦汗的功夫闲聊了几句，觉得两家孩子年龄差不多，当场就拍板定了亲。有时候男方还在外地当兵，根本不知道自己家里多了个媳妇儿，而女方却被死死锁在深闺里，别说打听未来丈夫的样子，就连跟陌生男人说一句话都会被戳脊梁骨，骂不体面。哪怕已经定了亲，男女双方在公开场合见一面，都会招来满村的流言蜚语。所以在那个年代，最残酷的事情莫过于新娘直到被塞进花轿的那一刻，才第一次见到自己的丈夫。放在今天，这简直是天方夜谭。婚姻本该是两个相爱的人在充分了解后决定共度一生，可那时的女人却要在对丈夫一无所知的情况下，胆战心惊地走进婚姻。有老人后来苦笑着说，直到揭开红盖头的那一秒，我才看清自己要嫁的人长什么样。他脾气好不好，人品怎么样，会不会疼人，全靠老天爷赏饭吃。他们没有反抗的权利，只能把一辈子的幸福压在这场毫无胜算的赌博里。而更绝望的是，就算赌输了，他们也没有退路。在那个年代的农村，离婚是个想都不敢想的词。就算两口子天天吵架，日子过不下去，唯一的解决办法也只有忍。忍一天，忍一年，忍到头发白了，眼睛花了，忍完一辈子。在这场漫长的消耗里，女人没有任何主动结束婚姻的权利，只有男人可以写休书，把妻子赶回娘家。而被休掉的女人会让整个家族都抬不起头，被全村人戳一辈子脊梁骨。所以绝大多数女人只能在名存实亡的婚姻里画地为牢，用一辈子的沉默和顺从去熬完这场没有尽头的苦行。也正因为结婚是一辈子的单行道，没有回头路，所以婚礼才被赋予了远超爱情的意义。它从来不是两个年轻人的私事，而是两个宗族正式结盟确立社会关系的盛大仪式。那时候的婚礼大多选在秋收后或者春节前后，只有这个时候地里的活忙完了，家里才有多余的粮食办酒席。 男方家会倾尽所有准备宴席，请来吹鼓手在村头吹吹打打。成亲那天，新郎骑着高头大马去接亲，身后跟着浩浩荡荡的队伍。对于一辈子面朝黄土背朝天的农民来说，这就是他们人生中最风光的时刻。迎亲队伍回村的时候，每过一个路口，唢呐和锣鼓就会使劲吹打。这震耳欲聋的声音，不只是在庆祝喜事，更是在向全村宣告，一个新的家庭成立了，一份延续香火的契约正式生效了。在那个交通不便、没什么娱乐的年代，这样一场婚礼会成为方圆几十里最热闹的新闻，被村里人议论好几个月。就在这场全村人的喧嚣里，嫁出去这3个字开始真正刻进新娘的命运里。按照老规矩，女人必须嫁到外村去，她们离开生养自己的家，离开有父母庇护的土地，从此变成另一个陌生家族的人。就算后来有女人嫁给本村人，嫁出去的规矩也没变，不管离娘家有多近，女人都必须住进丈夫家，去适应别人家的条条框框。而这种父系宗族的秩序，在婚礼的每一个细节里都体现得淋漓尽致。比如新郎要把新娘高高举起来，让她去抓门框上的纸蝴蝶。这看似是个喜庆的游戏，却是整场婚礼中夫妻俩唯一一次被允许的公开肢体接触。在那个年代，就算是明媒正娶的夫妻，在人前也不能有任何亲密举动，否则就会被骂不知羞耻。宴席上大家推杯换盏，好不热闹，但这都只是表面功夫。婚礼最核心、最严肃的环节发生在酒席散场之后。主持人会站在院子中央，高声念出男方家族所有长辈的名字，新婚夫妻要按照辈分挨个给他们鞠躬磕头。这场庄严的仪式根本不是什么祝福，而是一场公开的身份收编。他在向全村人和列祖列宗宣告，这个女人从此就是我们家的人了。从这一刻起，她不再是她自己，她必须变成一个合格的儿媳，一个温顺的妻子，一个能生儿子的生育机器。对于那个年代的女人来说，这种单方面的服从早就被刻进了骨子里。她们从小就被教育要守规矩、敬长辈、听家里的话，所以就算要给几十个陌生人磕头，就算要受各种委屈，也很少有人会反抗。因为在他们的认知里，女人的命本来就是这样的。可你以为熬过这些仪式就结束了吗？当宾客散尽，夜幕降临，真正让新娘无处可逃的噩梦才刚刚开始。那个被所有人期待的洞房花烛夜，从来都不属于新婚夫妻。按照老规矩，新郎的朋友们会一窝蜂挤进狭小的新房，大声起哄，开各种粗俗的玩笑。在别人眼里，这叫闹洞房，是热闹和祝福。可对于一个对丈夫还完全陌生的新娘来说，这是一场被当众围观、无处可逃的羞辱。而比闹洞房更荒唐的是，有些地方甚至还有一条不成文的规矩：新婚头几天，新房绝对不能锁门。长辈们自有一套歪理，小两口刚见面肯定害羞，所以得敞开大门，让亲戚邻居随时随便进出，美其名曰帮新人熟络熟络。在今天看来，这简直是对个人隐私的公然践踏。可在那个宗族利益大于一切的年代，却被包装成了天经地义的传统。但无论婚礼被折腾得多么离谱，所有的规矩、所有的仪式、所有的期待，最终都指向同一个终极目标：生孩子。在张庄村，人们给这个任务起了一个极其冰冷的名字：开门。什么是开门？不是推开家里的大门，而是给这个家族打开传宗接代的门。如果生不出儿子，这个家的香火就断了，门也就彻底关死了。在老一辈人的眼里，婚姻从来不是为了爱情，而是一场必须完成的繁衍接力。所以孩子生得越多越好。那时候农村医疗条件极差，孩子夭折是常有的事，多生几个是对抗风险的唯一办法。更何况儿子是地里的壮劳力，是老了以后唯一的依靠。可历史的车轮从来不会因为谁的执念而停下。到了上世纪80年代，这种非要生儿子不可的传统观念，终于和一项国家政策撞了个正着。一场将彻底改变无数中国家庭命运的巨变——计划生育正铺天盖地而来。与此同时，越来越多的年轻人开始离开土地，像候鸟一样涌向城市打工。那些曾经被视为家族命根子的儿子，再也不愿意留在村里种地了。延续了几千年的宗族观念，第一次裂开了一道深不见底的缝隙。可还没等村民们适应这种变化，计划生育的铁腕就已经伸到了每一个村庄。 新中国成立短短30多年，中国人口从4亿暴涨到了10亿。对于一个还在靠土地吃饭的农业国来说，这是前所未有的生存压力。如果再不控制人口，粮食、教育、住房、就业都会出大问题。正是在这样的背景下，计划生育成了基本国策，以不容置疑的力度向全国农村推进。可这项利国利民的政策在落地的那一刻，却和农村刻进骨子里的生存逻辑发生了最惨烈的碰撞。对于面朝黄土背朝天的农民来说，生儿子从来不是什么封建思想，而是活下去的刚需。问遍村里的老人，答案都一模一样，只有生儿子才能开门，才能续香火，才能把这个家传下去。女儿终究是泼出去的水，养大了就要嫁到别人家，变成别人的儿媳，别人的妈。养女儿说白了就是在替别人家养孩子。这种看似冷酷的观念背后是最血淋淋的现实。在没有养老保险的年代，儿子是唯一的养老保障。儿子会留在家里种地盖房，给父母养老送终。而女儿嫁出去以后，首先要伺候的是公婆。当时村里流传着一句最扎心的话：再不孝的儿子也能给你打一桶水，再孝顺的女儿回娘家也得带着老公孩子来吃饭。所以当计划生育开始限制生育数量时，农民们最害怕的不是少生一个孩子，而是万一没生出儿子，老了以后怎么办？在城市，工人有退休金，生男生女都一样，可在农村，没有儿子就等于老无所依。于是在巨大的生存焦虑下，哪怕面对最严格的政策，无数家庭还是想尽一切办法也要拼一个儿子。而这场国家政策与生存本能的惨烈碰撞，最终所有的重量都压在了最没有话语权的农村女人身上。她们被推到了风暴的最中心，进退两难。最开始生3个孩子必须结扎，没过多久就改成了生2个就得绝育。如果家里已经有1儿1女或者2个儿子，那手术就是板上钉钉的铁律。可如果连续生了2个女儿，政策执行就会留出一块所有人都心照不宣的灰色地带。因为谁都清楚，这个家一定会拼尽全力再生一个儿子。而这场制度与生存的拉扯里，最煎熬的永远是夹在中间的人。文英就是张庄村的计划生育干部，他的工作是每天盯着全村女人的肚子，催着去上环、去结扎，处理各种因为超生引发的矛盾。可脱下这身工作服，他也是张庄村的媳妇、妻子和婆婆。更要命的是，文英自己不能生育，2个孩子都是领养的。这个在当时不能说的秘密，成了他工作中最大的软肋。被政策逼急了的女人会指着他的鼻子破口大骂：你自己生不出来就嫉妒别人，逼着我们也绝后。这些像刀子一样扎心的话，文英只能全部咽进肚子里。她比谁都懂这些女人想要个儿子的渴望，可她是干部，必须完成上级的任务。她和这些姐妹无冤无仇，只是在执行命令而已。可最讽刺的是，这个天天劝别人结扎的计生干部，自己家也没能逃过传宗接代的魔咒。文英的儿媳妇刚生了一个女儿，按照政策，他们家还能再生一个。如果这一胎是儿子，那就算完成了任务；如果还是女儿，这个在村里说一不二的计生干部，也将和那些他曾经劝说过的女人一样，站在命运的十字路口。所以文英只能对自己更狠，更不近人情。他知道全村几百双眼睛都在盯着他，只要他自己家敢越雷池一步，整个村子的计生工作就会彻底崩盘。哪怕心里再理解，他也只能咬着牙硬撑着这副铁面无私的样子。可在张庄村，比能不能生更让女人恐惧的是结扎这2个字。每当有女人被通知要去公社做手术，各种恐怖的流言就会立刻传遍全村。所有人都说结扎会掏空女人的气血，会落下一辈子的病根，甚至会让人瘫痪，再也干不了活。这种对未知的恐惧像一块乌云，压在每一个育龄女人的心头。而最荒唐的是，从医学上讲，男人的结扎手术更简单、更安全，恢复更快。可在当时的农村，没有一个男人愿意站出来。在所有人的逻辑里，男人是家里的顶梁柱，绝对不能伤了身体。女人反正只是在家做饭带孩子，就算身体垮了也没什么大不了的。于是这场政策带来的所有风险、所有痛苦，全部一股脑地压在了女人身上。她们陷入了一个永远走不出来的死局，生不出儿子会被婆家骂成绝户，一辈子抬不起头。 为了生儿子超生会被罚款、被抄家、被村干部追得东躲西藏。可如果乖乖去做了结扎，就等于亲手断了生儿子的最后一丝希望。国家让他们少生，婆家逼他们生儿子。这两股相反的力量像一台巨大的液压机，把那一代农村女人死死夹在了中间，动弹不得。计划生育管住了人数，却没能管住人心。它限制了生育的数量，却没有改变重男轻女的观念。它控制了人口的增长，却没有解决农民养老的根本问题。所以所有的压力最终还是落在了最弱势的女人身上。而这一切的根源还要追溯到更遥远、更黑暗的过去。几千年来，对女性身体和意志的压迫从来就没有停止过。其中最残忍、最触目惊心的就是缠足。这项摧残女性的陋习，早在1912年就被中华民国明令禁止了。可法律的脚步永远追不上观念的改变。在那些偏远闭塞的农村，缠足又残忍地延续了几十年。很多出生在清末和民国的女孩依然没能逃过这场噩梦。今天的我们根本无法想象，一个社会竟然会主动把健康的女孩变成残疾人。可在那个病态的年代，小脚不仅是美的标准，更是女人嫁人的敲门砖。张庄村的缠足老人回忆说，那时候哪怕你长得再丑，只要有一双3寸金莲，就能嫁个好人家。可如果脚大，就算你再漂亮再能干，也会被所有人嫌弃，嫁不出去。为了这双所谓的美脚，女孩们从6、7岁开始就要接受这场残酷的酷刑。除了大脚趾，其余4根脚趾被生生掰断，压在脚掌底下，然后用长长的裹脚布一圈一圈死死地缠紧，让骨头在重压下慢慢变形愈合，最终变成畸形的3寸金莲。这个过程要持续好几年，疼痛贯穿了他们的整个童年，伤口反复溃烂，脓血浸透了裹脚布，每次拆开清洗都会连皮带肉一起撕下来。很多女孩疼得整夜在炕上打滚，连路都走不了，只能在地上爬。可就算这样，也没有人会心疼她们，甚至连他们的亲生母亲都会一边流着泪，一边把裹脚布缠得更紧。因为所有人都告诉他们，只有小脚才是美的，只有小脚才能嫁个好人家，只有小脚你这辈子才能有活路。而最残酷的地方从来不是肉体上的断骨之痛，很多女人不是被刀架在脖子上逼去缠足的，她们是被整个社会的审美和价值观洗了脑。她们打心底里相信这份非人的痛苦是值得的。这种观念的毒害有多深？后来政府明令禁止缠足，逼着大家放脚，可很多女孩和母亲反而陷入了巨大的恐慌。她们怕脚变大了嫁不出去，怕被人骂成大脚婆，怕被全村人嘲笑。于是荒唐的一幕出现了，很多姑娘前脚刚在村干部的要求下放开了脚，后脚就躲进屋里，偷偷把裹脚布又缠了回去。缠足带来的伤害并不会随着婚礼的鞭炮声消失，恰恰相反，当她们披上嫁衣，离开娘家，走进另一个陌生的宗族，真正长达几十年的生存考验才刚刚开始。直到新中国成立，缠足终于彻底绝迹，包办婚姻的锁链也开始松动。可中国农村女人的处境并没有一夜之间变好。一位50年代出嫁的老人说，比起我妈和我婆婆，我已经掉进蜂窝里了，至少不用缠足，不用被当成牲口一样卖掉。可纵然身处高喊平等的新时代，她每日清晨醒来，身上依旧套着名为儿媳本分的隐形枷锁。围裙是她的战袍，灶台是她的疆土，而洗衣、做饭、侍奉公婆、拉扯孩子，像一张密不透风的网，将她作为人的自由死死困住。她说，我活在新社会，可我妈和我婆婆吃过的苦，我一样也没少吃。那个吃人的封建时代从来就没有真正走远，但变化还是在悄无声息地发生着。几十年后，当这位老人自己也成了婆婆，她惊讶地发现，传统的婆媳天平彻底倒过来了。过去新媳妇进门要像丫鬟一样低眉顺眼，看婆婆的脸色过日子，现在反过来了，婆婆要小心翼翼地看儿媳妇的脸色，连句重话都不敢说，更别说刁难了。这种看似戏剧性的反转，背后是几千年家庭结构的崩塌。在过去，女人嫁进婆家就是个无依无靠的外人，她切断了和原生家庭的所有联系，在这个新家里没有任何话语权。她这辈子唯一的依靠就是自己的儿子，所以婆婆和媳妇儿注定要为了争夺这个唯一的男人斗一辈子。婆婆怕儿子娶了媳妇儿忘了娘， 媳妇儿怕自己在这个家没有立足之地。千百年来，这场没有硝烟的战争从来就没有停过，可灵巧和她的婆婆却跳出了这个死循环。这两代女人之间没有勾心斗角，没有互相算计，反而成了彼此最坚实的依靠，甚至可以说是读过书的灵巧把这位在深渊里隐忍了一辈子的老人给救了出来。而他们之间最动人的故事发生在灵巧人生最灰暗的时刻。灵巧曾经2次流产，在很多农村家庭，流产是女人最大的罪过，公婆会骂你克夫不下蛋，会把所有的错都怪在你头上。灵巧也怕，她怕婆婆怪她，怕自己在这个家再也抬不起头。可没想到，那个一辈子没读过书的婆婆一句责怪的话都没说。她拖着苍老的身子坐在灵巧床边，紧紧握着她的手，温柔地说：孩子，这不怪你，是命不好，不是你的错。这位老人之所以能有这份超越时代的宽厚，是因为他自己就是从地狱里爬出来的。他的一辈子就是一部救中国农村女人的苦难史。当年灵巧要嫁过来的时候，全村人都劝她，说她公公是出了名的老封建，脾气暴躁，思想守旧，嫁过去肯定要受一辈子气。可灵巧嫁过来之后才发现，这个家里最通透最开明的人竟然是这个一辈子受气的婆婆。老人一辈子活在丈夫的高压之下，年轻时不敢反抗，中年时为了孩子忍气吞声，直到灵巧嫁过来，她才第一次感受到了被人尊重的滋味。她常说，自从灵巧进了门，我才第一次觉得自己是个人。她开始跟着灵巧去赶集，去听戏，去做那些年轻时连想都不敢想的事。孙子的出生更是给她的晚年带来了前所未有的快乐。在家里，灵巧总是抢着干重活，让婆婆先吃饭，先休息。这份来自晚辈的尊重和体贴，对这位操劳了一辈子的老人来说，就是最大的幸福。而这个小家庭里的温情改变，不过是那个大时代洪流中的一朵小小的浪花。真正彻底改变中国农村女人命运的，是一场席卷全国的运动——农业集体化。在过去，男人是地里的主力，女人只能围着锅台转。他们干再多的活也不算数，因为他们的劳动没有经济价值。直到公分制度的出现，这是人类历史上第一次女人的汗水被白纸黑字的记录下来。他们在地里干的活能换公分，能换粮食，能换钱。他们第一次靠自己的劳动成为了家庭收入的重要来源，也第一次他们的价值被整个村子看见，被承认，被尊重。可这条路走得依旧艰难。一开始，女人的工分永远比男人低一截，但至少他们的汗水第一次有了被看见、被计算的资格。很多男人不服气，说女人力气小，干不了重活，凭什么要同工同酬？村里的妇女干部站出来反驳：你们男人不是天天扛麻袋，我们女人干完地里的活，回家还要做饭、洗衣、带孩子、伺候老人，这些活难道就不算数吗？吵到最后，村里改成了计件工资，干多少活拿多少钱。可让所有大老爷们大跌眼镜的是，在收割高粱、掰玉米、摘棉花这些需要耐心和细心的农活上，女人干的比男人快得多，好得多。常常是女人们已经干完活走到了地头，男人们还坐在地垄沟里抽烟歇气。可就算这样，月底算账的时候，女人们还是要跟队长吵上半天，才能拿到本该属于他们的工钱。好不容易熬到了改革开放，本以为日子会越来越好，可新的难题又来了。男人们开始背起行囊，涌向城市打工，地里的重活一下子全压在了留守女人的肩上。于是，一个让人心酸的现象出现了：男人在外面挣钱，女人在家里，既要当男人，又要当女人。他们要在烈日下种地，要回家照顾老人孩子，要洗衣做饭，要操持家里的一切。可就算这样，男人们过年回家，依旧往炕上一坐，等着饭菜上桌。这也难怪，村里的孩子都跟母亲最亲。因为在他们成长的无数个日夜里，那个为他们遮风挡雨的人从来都是母亲。这种既要上班挣钱，又要包揽家务的双重负担，直到今天依然压在很多中国女人的身上。与此同时，工业化的浪潮也冲进了张庄村。村头建起了模具片的工厂，流水线上做的全是村里的年轻姑娘。这份工作挣钱多，却也危险，砂轮飞转，火星四溅，一不小心就会割伤手指。劣质的原材料会让伤口烂几个月都好不了， 1982年夏天，一场史无前例的罢工爆发了。原因很简单，工厂连续几个月不发劳保用品，连说好的奖金也赖账。但真正的原因是，这些走出了家门，走进了工厂的年轻女孩，第一次意识到了自己的价值。她们不再是任人摆布的受气包，她们要为自己的权益抗争。她们没有闹事，也没有吵架，只是在一个清晨，集体背着干粮，躲进了村后的大山里。工厂开不了工，厂长急得团团转。村干部家里人轮番上山劝说，可姑娘们铁了心，不解决问题绝不回去。最终工厂妥协了，补发了所有东西。放在今天，这不过是一场普通的劳资纠纷。可在40多年前的农村，这是破天荒的头一回。这些年轻的女孩用自己的行动证明，女人也可以说不。可时代的阳光并没有照到每一个角落，还有一些女人，她们被拐卖，被买卖，在别人的家里过了一辈子没有尊严的日子。就算到了晚年，当她们想说说自己的遭遇时，丈夫和儿子还会骂她家丑不可外扬。你想让我们全家都抬不起头吗？他们的苦难从来没有人真正关心过，他们只能把眼泪和委屈咽进肚子里，带进坟墓里。幸运的是，在他们生命的最后时光里，时代终于变了，他们终于可以不用再看任何人的脸色，可以去赶集，去听戏，可以堂堂正正地做自己。这份迟来的自由虽然晚了几十年，却依然滚烫。回顾张庄村这3代女人的一生，我们看到的是一部浓缩的中国农村女性命运史。从断骨缠足到坦然放脚，从包办婚姻到自由恋爱，从大门不出二门不迈到走进工厂为自己抗争，从一辈子依附男人到靠自己的双手养活自己。这短短50年发生的变化超过了过去的5000年，可历史的进步从来都不是一条直线。直到今天，重男轻女的观念依然存在，职场歧视、家庭暴力、育儿负担依然是很多女人要面对的难题。但至少有一点已经彻底改变了，那些曾经被视为天经地义的规矩，那些曾经压得女人喘不过气的枷锁，如今终于开始被打破了。可当旧时代远去，新的问题也随之而来。当越来越多女性拥有选择权的同时，婚姻本身也正在经历新的挑战。高彩礼、买房压力、婚恋观念变化，离婚率上升，新的矛盾正在取代旧的矛盾。张庄村的女人们曾经为了获得选择权而奋斗，而今天的女性则要在拥有选择的自由后，去学会如何承担自由的重量。前人用半个多世纪的眼泪与反抗，替我们撕开了那张密不透风的封建大网。而留给现代女性的课题，不再是如何逃离锅台与包办婚姻，而是如何在物欲横流、观念碰撞的十字路口，安放好自己的爱与尊严。
好，杀，落杆，落，魁梧手，好，魁。
就是结过婚那天晚上闹动嘛，你不喜欢也不行啊，你要是你不要订婚吧。
生男孩了就是个大喜啦，就是生女孩了就是小喜吧，也不能学成不喜，就是大小喜。生了男孩以后就是学咱们这个家里了，要是生了女孩嘞，就是出家嘞啊，不在咱们这个家。孙子跟孙女2个，那个是个大喜，这个是个小喜。
In many areas of the Chinese countryside, a woman's marriage is called 找婆家, finding a mother-in-law's house. A husband refers to his wife as 我家里的, the person inside my home. And when a woman is described as 没孩子, childless, it often really means that she does not have a son. In Longbo, a village about 400 miles southwest of Beijing, young people are gradually abandoning these expressions. But the ancient traditions of male dominance fade slowly. I'm an American born and raised in Beijing. In 1971, I came to Longbo for the first time. During several visits since then, I've made friends with many women. Although we live in different worlds, their suffering and their strength, their frustrations and their joys remain with me. Conditions and customs vary greatly in China's vast countryside. No one village can represent all of China. Yet the personal experiences of these women in Longbo village offer a glimpse of the forces that have shaped the lives of peasant women for most of this century. Lin Qiao is one of the few women in Longbo who graduated from high school. Her education enabled her to see things somewhat differently from many other women in the village. Contact between young men and women was more tolerated in high school than in any other rural setting. And it was there that Lin Qiao met and fell in love with her husband, Ming Quan. But their romance still caused great embarrassment when it was discovered.
My classmates noticed that we were close. They didn't say anything, but they gave me funny looks. One day after school, I was walking home with my girlfriends. The boys were way ahead of us. Suddenly, I saw carved on a tree trunk, Ling Qiao and Ming Quan are a couple. I was so angry. I took out my pocket knife and scratched a huge X over it. After high school, I didn't want to get married right away. I wanted to do something useful for my village first. But Ming Quan's father made a big fuss. He was very old. One day, he refused to get out of bed. He said he would just lie there until he died unless his son got married. So Ming Quan begged and begged me, and I finally agreed. My parents were very much against it because they had heard that his father was terribly feudal-minded, an old diehard. After a lot of discussion, my father finally agreed. He said, "Well, it's your choice. If it doesn't work out, don't blame me for not finding you the right family." So I got married. And it turned out that his father wasn't sick at all. He got up and went to work every day. A few years later, I walked by the high school on my way to a fair. I remembered that tree with our names carved in it and looked for it. Our names had grown this big.
Like most rural women, Lin Qiao moved in with her husband's family. They live with Ming Quan's mother, who is 60 years old, and his father, who is 77. Last year, Lin Qiao gave birth to a boy. The extended family shares 3 rooms and a kitchen built around a courtyard. Not every young woman plays as large a role as Lin Qiao did in choosing her husband. Parents and go-betweens usually initiate marriage discussions. Then the couple involved makes a decision after very limited contact with one another. This situation is different from the old days when young people had no say at all in their own marriage. Is it easy to meet a young man on your own?
I wasn't in school long enough, only got through 6th grade. I left school when I was 13.
Yes, she was too young then. Now she's working in a village workshop with other young girls. It's not easy for her to meet anyone. It's different in factories and schools, but around here we're not used to young men and women getting together on their own. Everyone would badmouth them. Anyway, when a daughter grows up, you don't want her to run around wild.
So you have to make arrangements for your daughter.
Yes. The parents talk things over and find a suitable match. Then if the young people agree, they get married.
Before you were engaged, how well did you know your fiancé?
We didn't have much to do with each other. We never talked by ourselves, and we never went to a movie together. If you're not engaged, then who is he to you? Who are you to him, running to each other's houses like that? That's really indecent. Once you're engaged, then everyone knows so-and-so is going to marry so-and-so, and then it's all right.
Once you're engaged and get to know the man, what if you don't like him?
You break off the engagement.
That's allowed?
Yes, but it's not good. People will say, why did you get engaged in the first place? Didn't you know what you were getting into?
Can you two sit a little closer? Did you know each other when you were kids?
Yes, we did.
Are you two engaged?
Yes, I guess we're engaged. We haven't had a ceremony, but everything's decided.
Getting married in the old days must have been quite different from today. Can you tell me how you got married?
Oh, you tell her. I can't talk as well as you can.
Oh, I can't talk about that stuff. Ask her. She knows how to talk.
What I say will be about me, not about you.
You can speak for all of us.
How can I speak for you?
I sure don't know how to talk about that.
Well, who found a husband for you?
An old matchmaker. She came to our house and told my parents, now you'd better find a home for her.
Did the matchmaker talk to you?
No, she only talked with the older folks. If your parents agreed to the match, then that was that.
She didn't talk to you at all?
She'd never talked to me. I was so young I didn't know what was going on.
She was only this big.
Not much taller than that little boy.
That young and your marriage was already decided?
Yes, our families arranged it. In those days, you had no say. Once your parents got it settled, that was that.
How was your marriage brought up?
I don't know.
Who brought it up? Did the two of you talk?
I don't know how to talk about this.
You don't know? How can you be engaged if you don't know how it was brought up?
Well, I knew her before I joined the army, but we were too young then.
So your parents thought it was a good match and started talking?
Yes. Our mothers were working together, and they talked about it. I was still in the army.
So you didn't know all this was going on?
That's right.
Your parents could see the man, but you couldn't?
Oh, no way.
What unmarried girl went to see a man? How shameful.
You didn't see him until you arrived at your wedding.
So you didn't know what kind of person he was?
That's right. Whether he was blind or crippled, you were stuck with him.
During the wedding, a rowdy crowd would hang around and shout, "New bride, fill my pipe." So you'd go around filling their pipes. That was when you discovered who your husband was.
Since you and your husband were strangers when you married, what happened if you couldn't get along?
Couldn't get along? Well, you fought. No divorce in those days.
What if you just couldn't live together?
Then you just fought some more. There was no way to separate. Of course, the man could get rid of you, send you back to your mother's house.
Did that happen in this village?
Oh, it was rare. Very few people separated. You just fought your whole life long. What else could you do? No divorce in those days.
Weddings are usually held after harvest or at New Year's. The groom's family hires a band and prepares a feast. The groom rides on horseback to the bride's village. He is accompanied by 4 people from his family. They take extra horses to bring back the bride and a few of her relatives. Once back in the groom's village, the procession stops at every street corner while the band plays to attract crowds. In the past, women generally married into other villages. Recently, it has become more common for women in Longbo to marry within the village. But a woman still must move to her husband's house. When the bride arrives, the groom's friends dangle a paper butterfly over the courtyard gate, and the groom has to lift the bride up to catch it. This is the only time the villagers see the couple touch one another. From then on, they will always stay at least a few feet apart in public. Once the bride enters the courtyard, she goes to change her clothes. Then the feast begins. Close relatives, special friends, and the musicians are served meat dishes and hard liquor. The rest of the guests eat noodles. After the feast, the ceremony takes place. A friend of the groom reads a list of the relatives in the man's family. As each name is read, the couple bows. Did you have to bow at your wedding?
Yes. But I didn't give a damn. I didn't wait for them to push me down.
Of course, when the time comes, I'll have to bow. This is the custom. Every family has these rules. No woman can avoid it. You have to do it.
Weddings are occasions when men get together and have a good time. They play drinking games and push each other to get drunk. It is very rare for a woman to join in the merrymaking.
On the wedding night, a rowdy crowd gathers in the newlyweds' room. Even if you don't like it, there's nothing you can do. Everyone who comes that night is a good friend of the groom. If you're too embarrassed and try to run away, then your husband will be very angry. But usually you can't run away because they watch you really closely.
The newlyweds aren't comfortable together. That's why there's all that rowdiness on the first night. The groom's parents are afraid that the two of them will be shy. So for 9 days after the wedding, the newlyweds are not allowed to lock their door. The groom's friends can come in and loosen them up.
Does everyone want to get married?
Oh, everyone wants to get married. A man gets a wife to open the door. That's what getting a wife is for. Open the door and establish descendants.
What does opening the door mean?
Without future generations, doesn't your house simply close down? The more children, the more prosperity. You give birth to as many as your fate has in store. Now the state wants fewer children. There's birth control.
I believe in birth control. When my kids don't listen to me, I cuss them out and say, "Too bad birth control came too late for you." Will I ever stop having trouble with these kids? They were so naughty when they were little. Now they're grown up and won't work at all. I have to work with a sore arm. I do all the field work by myself.
Your sons don't work?
They don't work.
Why not?
They don't want to work in the fields.
What do they want to do?
Oh, a nice city job. Not one of them wants to work in the fields.
In the last 35 years, China's population has increased from 400 million to over 1 billion. If this expansion goes unchecked, the nation will face severe food shortages by the end of the century. The government is adopting increasingly drastic measures to reduce population growth. But country people still refuse to accept a smaller family if it does not include at least one son. Why do people in the countryside prefer boys?
A boy is good. He can open the door and have more children. But a girl, she'll grow up and leave. You've raised her for someone else.
That's right. The boy stays home. The boy brings in a wife.
A daughter's not family, she's only a relative. Once she grows up and marries, she's no more than a relative, is she? There's an old saying, an unfilial son will at least fetch water for you, but a filial daughter will only bring you mouths to eat your food. That's the truth. Your daughter brings her husband and her kid, 3 mouths to feed.
In the factories and mines, workers are allowed only one child, whether it's a boy or a girl. But there's no way this policy can be enforced in the countryside, because we're farmers. In the factories, they earn a regular salary. But here, everyone works the land. You just can't do without a son. A daughter will leave the family when she gets married. How can you survive without a son?
A few years ago, a woman had to be sterilized after the 3rd child. Now it's after the 2nd child. If she has a boy and a girl, or 2 boys, then she definitely has to be sterilized. But if she only has 2 girls, she can wait for the time being.
How many children do you have?
I have a boy and a girl.
So your situation is ideal. Were you sterilized?
I was unable to bear children. I adopted them.
Since you've got what you wanted, do people resent you for telling them to stop trying?
Yes, some women get very nasty and say, "You're barren, so you don't want us to have babies either." It hurts me a lot. Why should I want to control them? But this is my responsibility. This is a state policy issued directly from the central government. It's not that I have anything personal against these women. Each team has a woman responsible for birth control when Ying is in charge of the whole village.
Wen Ying's daughter-in-law just had a baby girl. According to the local birth control regulations, she still has another chance to try for a boy.
说是你是对小孩安全，对小孩好，说是这个迷信，说是有什么鬼啊神啊，你说是刷上就交代了他了，有钱花了，有米吃了，迷信了这是。
Is your daughter-in-law going to keep trying for a boy?
I'm in charge of birth control here, and I can't break the rules. If the government allows it because country people need a son, she'll have another baby in a few years.
Right after Wen Ying got her daughter-in-law, people began to talk. They said, once that daughter-in-law has her quota of kids, she'd better get sterilized. Otherwise, we'll smash up her house.
Most women are afraid the operation will ruin their health.
Why is birth control dependent on sterilizing women? Aren't there other methods?
Yes, a man can have an operation, but people here aren't used to the idea. They feel that women are just housewives. If a woman's health is ruined, it doesn't matter as much, since she stays home anyway. This is the attitude in China.
Women are expected to take all the physical risks of birth control. They are also subjected to tremendous psychological pressure. The birth control policy does not challenge the traditional attitudes which favor a son, nor does it address the social and economic conditions that make a son necessary. While the state restricts the number of children and the family demands a son, women are caught in a double bind. The problems women face today are rooted in a long-standing pattern of male dominance. In the past, the most obvious sign of this oppression was the practice of foot binding. This custom was officially banned early in this century, but it lingered on in rural areas for decades.
If I got into a fight with a woman, all I had to do was stomp on her feet and she'd be finished. She'd fall down. How could she ever win?
That's because she had bound feet?
Yes. One stomp and she'd hurt so much she'd just have to sit down.
So you had an advantage in fights, didn't you?
That's the way it was in the old feudal times.
How old were you when you had your feet bound?
6 years old.
Her feet used to be really tiny. I found a shoe of hers that was only this long. Now her feet are larger because they've been unbound.
In the old days, no one wanted to marry a woman with big feet. Blind or lame, your feet had to be small. If these fingers were toes and this thumb was a big toe, the fingers would have been bound under like this. When I walk around all day, I'm actually stepping on my bent-over toes.
To bind a foot, you hold it tight and wind up the bindings. Only the big toe is left straight. Then you tie the binding around the ankle. I'll show you how it's done. Since I don't have binders anymore, I'll use my legging. My feet were first bound when I was 7, and they were much better looking than this. Look at this lump. When I was 11, which batch of soldiers was here then? Anyway, they came to ban foot binding. We were so scared we hid in the cornfields and everywhere. If we were caught, we'd be fined. So I let my feet out. Then I felt so ashamed of my big feet. If you want small feet, you bind them up like this. Wrap all around, cover every spot, and then tie them up. It caused terrible sores.
Pus ran out of the sores on my feet. It soaked through several layers of bindings and hardened into a crust. When I washed my feet, I had to soak them over and over to soften the crust before I could tear off the bindings. And skin and flesh got torn off with the cloth. Then later, my feet just became a slushy mess. The pain was unbearable. When my mother told me to walk on them, all I could do was cry. When I went to the outhouse, I couldn't walk. I had to crawl.
Were you willing to have your feet bound?
How could we not be willing?
Everyone else did it. People said tiny feet were good.
After a wedding, they'd show the bride off around the village. She'd sit in a cart with her legs crossed. Everyone gathered around. Some would shout, new bride, she's coming out to bow, eating steamed buns, oh, everyone knows how. Hey, let's see the feet. If the feet were big, they'd say, the face isn't half bad, but get a load of those feet. And they'd walk off. My red wedding shoes, they were this long. I was so ashamed. One day, my in-laws were sitting in the doorway. As I walked toward them, I overheard them saying, just look at this. The person hasn't shown up yet, and her 2 feet have already arrived. Those awful big feet. So I took a year and bound them up again.
Now young women run around and their feet don't hurt. When I'm on my feet all day, they bother me and I have to rest. But when I see this little guy, I forget how tired I am. I love him so much. I keep fussing around and taking care of him. Oh, I sure have suffered.
My village was 4 miles away. I was carried here in a sedan chair. My face was covered by a piece of cloth. I was scared. After the wedding, my older brother came to say goodbye. Stay here, he said. Don't get upset, and do as you're told. I pleaded, oh, please come back soon and take me home. And I started to cry. I was supposed to be 15 when I got married, but really I was only 13. In those days, women not married by age 16 were rare. Already at 11 or 12, you weren't allowed out of the house. Just look at young women today, running down the street with 2 long braids swishing behind their backs. We could never do that.
In the old days, we hardly ever got to see a new bride.
Why? Didn't I tell you? Women weren't allowed out of the house. Talk about being oppressed. Look at young women today, married in the morning and already running around wild in the afternoon. They really have a good time. A daughter-in-law had no right to speak. Her in-laws gave the orders. She didn't dare leave the house.
Since you came from another village, how could you get to know anyone if you didn't leave your husband's courtyard?
It was really hard. When you heard a vendor, that was your chance to go out. You had to ask your mother-in-law, Mother, the vendor's here. May I go out and buy a needle and some thread? She'd pull a long face like this. And then say, go ahead. She'd wait a long time before she'd let you go. And then you had to hurry back. Oh, I can't tell you how bad it was. We were really oppressed.
The many efforts to improve women's status since the turn of the century had little impact on the countryside. Then came the revolution of 1949, which the Chinese refer to as liberation. For women in Longbo, the revolution brought certain basic changes. They began to have a say in choosing their husbands. They could initiate a divorce. The revolution eliminated the very worst poverty and improved health care. The revolution also gave women the words to name their oppression. Among the new terms introduced into common speech was the word feudal. It is used mostly in reference to authoritarian family relationships. A tyrannical husband, mother-in-law, or parent is disapprovingly called a 老封建, an old feudal.
I got married right after liberation. Things were already much better. Still, I knew my duties as a daughter-in-law. I cooked and washed the dishes and so on. I didn't run around much outside the house. That was already the new society. I haven't experienced any real oppression. When I was a young girl, things were really feudal. Nowadays, when you get a daughter-in-law, you have to put her up on a pedestal. You pamper her. You don't dare to treat her badly or criticize her. She only does household chores when she feels like it. In our day, that wouldn't do.
In the past, a woman entered her husband's family as a stranger. The only secure emotional bond she could establish was with her son. Her son's marriage threatened that bond. The new daughter-in-law was often abused. Even today, tension between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law is common in rural families. But Ling Qiao and her mother-in-law are unusually close. They support each other in the family. In fact, it was only because of Ling Qiao's encouragement that her mother-in-law finally began to stand up for her own rights in the house.
I was pregnant twice before and had miscarriages. Most mothers-in-law are still very feudal. They think you're bad luck and say, "What is a woman good for anyway besides having children? And you can't even do this one thing right?" After my miscarriage, I was very sad. I also worried that my in-laws would be annoyed. I was so depressed I couldn't eat. But my mother-in-law was not so old-fashioned. She actually tried to comfort me. "Don't worry," she said. "It's not that you couldn't get pregnant, you just lost the baby." I felt so relieved.
So she's much more open-minded than the others.
I've suffered myself, so I know what it's like.
Many people warned me not to marry into this family. They said it was too feudal.
They said my old man was too feudal.
People said I would be sure to suffer. But I found that my mother-in-law was even more open-minded than most people. She's not feudal at all.
This family had a bad reputation in the village. Actually, it wasn't me. It was my old man. But now he's too old. He can't throw his weight around anymore. Ever since she married into this family, I've felt happy and free. I started going out to see operas. I've really risen up in the world.
Now that I've had this baby, she has more energy than ever. At mealtimes, she insists that I eat first while she takes care of my baby. I've really got it good here.
Longbo village has a population of over 2,000 people. The main crops are corn and wheat. In the past, most people made their living by farming, but women mainly worked inside the home. If they ventured out of their courtyards, they only went as far as the neighborhood millstone. In the 1950s, women gradually started to work in the collective fields and bring home an income. Their contribution to the family became measurable and their status improved. But until recently, daily pay rates for women were much lower than for men.
Men objected to women getting the same wages. They'd argue, "We men can carry the heavy grain sacks, can you?" When the men talked this way, I'd tell them off. "You can't simply judge women on that one point. We women can give birth to babies, can you?" I'd tease them like that and I'd tell them, "It doesn't make sense just to look at one thing. After all, men don't carry heavy gunny sacks every day."
Later, the village implemented a piecework system to increase efficiency. But men were offended when some women earned more than they did under this system.
The pay for harvesting sorghum was based on the number of rows you cut. One day, Yu Qing and her team of women worked very fast. When they got to the end of the field, the men were still sitting around. But Yu Qing still had to fight the village accountant for higher pay. So I told the accountant, "Listen, the men were all sitting around while the women worked. Why shouldn't the women get more pay?
当妇女这个干部啊，你就是为了这个妇女。
The job of a women's leader is to stick up for women's rights. If she doesn't speak up, then the women will lose out.
Now we have piecework. Everyone gets the same rate for picking a row of corn. This is fair. Men are slower at this job than women. Often a woman earns 15 points a day, and a man only earns 10 points. So women like piecework.
It looks like only women are doing this job.
That's true. There's only one man, and he's in charge of recording work points. This year, most of the men took outside jobs to earn money. Farm work is left for the women.
Yes, only women work in the fields. Men take jobs and earn money.
Can women earn money too?
Yes, but women are tied down with children and housework. Very few women go out and earn money.
How come you can work in the fields when you have kids, but you can't take other jobs?
You go to the fields whenever you have a free moment, like after you've cooked the meals early in the morning or after sundown. If you work for money, you have to be on time. That's the difference.
I learned to drive a tractor. I even had a license. But now I don't know how anymore. There was no way to arrange the shifts. A woman and a man working together in the fields at night just sounds scandalous. The men didn't want to work with me. How could I keep that job? And when you leave the village on money-earning jobs, say hauling coal or dirt, if you have to stay somewhere overnight, it's very inconvenient for a woman. It just couldn't work. So I gave up.
Now that women have two jobs, one outside and the other inside the house, are men taking equal responsibility at home?
Oh no, not in a lifetime. How can you ever have equality in housework? You think a woman can expect the man to help keep the kids neat and clean? He'll never do it. Why are children so close to their mothers and not their fathers? Because the mother takes care of them. She'll look at the kid. Oh, his jacket is dirty. I'd better wash it. And the man? He gets up in the morning and takes off. He'll never even notice.
In recent years, a highway and a railroad have been built near Longbo. Large factories moved into the area, and the village began to develop its own small-scale industry. One Longbo shop contracts work from a state-run saw blade factory. All the workers in the village shop are young, unmarried women. They polish saw blades. In the summer of 1982, the workers walked out.
In managing this shop, I tried different things. At first, only girls worked here. I thought men would be fine too, so I hired some men. But it didn't work out. Men are too strong and can't sit still for that long. They can't stand the confinement. It's like being in prison, sitting there like this. They can't take this kind of work.
The work is very dangerous. If you're not careful, your hand will hit against the wheel. And the wheel is very rough. Even if you bumped into a spare one lying around, you can get badly cut. And the stuff seems very poisonous. A cut takes a long time to heal. Now we're divided up into different shifts. But when we first started, we worked straight for 24 hours. It was endless, exhausting. The pay is good, but the work is very hard. The saw blade polishing shop makes more money than any other workshop in the village.
Why did you quit work and run away?
Last year, for 7 months, we didn't get our safety supplies or bonuses. We didn't get gloves, face masks, towels, and soap. Or our cash bonuses. So we got angry and ran off to Big Ridge Mountain.
For 5 or 6 months, the workers didn't get their safety supplies and subsidies. Since the village owned the saw blade factory, Its income was used to finance the spring planting season. I tried to explain to the workers that there was a cash flow problem and that they would be paid later. But they thought I was lying to them. So I gave up explaining. And they were so narrow-minded and petty that they stopped working.
The manager came after us to go back to work. If he found you, it was hard to refuse, so the best way was to hide out for the day. A shutdown cost thousands of dollars. It's serious business. So we ran off and didn't come back till dark. The manager came and scolded us, hopping mad.
You see, if they didn't run away, the village leaders would be after them. Every one of the leaders got called upon to get these girls back to work. If the girls stayed in their own houses, one might have refused to go back to work while another might have been pressured into agreeing. If they didn't stick together, they would lose out.
I called a meeting, but couldn't find any of the girls. Where did they go? I went to house after house, and they were nowhere to be found. We looked for them all through the night and all the next day.
In a state-owned factory, a walkout would be regarded as counter-revolutionary. But a village workshop operates like a family enterprise. The manager of the longbow saw blade shop is related to many of the workers, and the young women turn over their pay to their parents. Although the workers were unhappy about benefits and working conditions, they were reluctant to confront the manager directly. Running away brought the issue to a head.
That night, we were gathered together for a meeting. The manager came, and the first one he called on was me. "Well, girl, are you going to get back to work or not?" "Get going," he yelled. But I didn't dare move. If I went and the others didn't, they would all blame me. I was afraid. I just sat there. He turned to one and then another, but couldn't get anyone to move. So he went to get help from the village head.
When I arrived in the courtyard, all the girls were sitting together. They were silent and pouting. I asked, "Are you going back to work or not?" They said, "Sure, we'll go back. But can we work without face masks? It's cold and there's no heat. Is that going to be taken care of?" They brought up all their grievances. I tried to persuade the manager, saying, "All right, they go back to work, and you agree to do your part at the same time. Don't make it into a contest to see who gives in first. Don't get bogged down in this."
I was angry, very angry. I got the girls together and fired one of them. I talked it over with the village leaders. I also suspended a few. The others had to go back to work, or they would all be fired. So I dealt with the troublemakers. The girls who were suspended were allowed back in a few days. The girl who was fired came back after 6 months. As long as she recognized her mistake and was willing to change, we let her come back. Now they're all back at work. Everything's fine.
He agreed to our demands. Only then did we go back to work. After that, he fired a few girls, but production went down. If he hired new people, he'd have to train them. It would take a long time before they could do as good a job. So he had to call back the ones he fired. When I get married, though, I'll quit that job. It's really not a pleasant place to work. I'll only do it for a few more years for the sake of my family. Once I marry and leave home, I'll quit.
跟爷爷再见，爷在那儿嘞，爷在那儿嘞，快，跟爷再见，打起场戏。那不是爷，爷在那儿嘞，我叫，行啊，那不是爷，叫爷，那不是爷，爷爷那了，再见，跟爷再见呗，再见，快点，跟爷再见。哎呀，磕头嘞，不会再见。拿出去了。
For country people, cultural life still centers around the traditional village fair. It takes place every 2 or 3 weeks in different locations. One of the biggest attractions at the fair is the opera. It's free and it's performed all day long.
She loves to listen to this.
Often at night I can't fall asleep, and then I wake up before dawn. I thought it would be so nice if I could listen to some opera. So I asked the children to buy me this. I said, I'll raise pigs for a whole year, and you buy me one of these.
We promised last year to buy her a tape recorder. So she raised a few pigs, sold 2 of them, and we bought this. She listens to it all the time.
I love to listen to opera, but they don't listen to that stuff.
刘师爷，他们都走了，您请出来吧。
Life is so great now. I've never had it so good before. When I was young, my family was poor. My father wanted to sell me. He said, I'll sell my daughter to whoever comes up with $200. And this old duffer here came up with the money.
Back then, I paid silver coins.
My father bought grain with the money. Other people said, you're going to marry a much older man. But what could I do? I was already sold. I couldn't refuse, so I agreed to come take a look at this place. If it was no good, I wouldn't stay.
Was he good to you?
Good or bad, I depended on my own work. I just endured everything waiting for my 2 sons to grow up. Oh, it kills me to talk about the past. I wore the same 2 homespun jackets my whole life. Now they're worn out and I don't wear them anymore. I wove cloth and I tried to bring up my children. Now they've grown up, and look at what they eat, look at what they wear. It's like living in paradise now.
As the daylight faded, I had to end my conversation with Ling Qiao's mother-in-law. The story of how she was sold to her husband made me want to find out more about her past. But the next day, she refused to talk. When I asked why, she became very upset.
人都说的来了年还来受气骂我了，老汉也骂，孩也骂，你都说这个不是不好看。
I got bullied for talking about the past.
你说不要脸了你。
My old man and my son scolded me. They said I had no sense of shame. They said I'd lost face for the family.
They just think it doesn't sound good to say you were sold here, that's all.
Well, I'm mad as hell. I wasn't even talking about this family, the Wongs. I was talking about my own family, the Chins. And just for that, my sons picked on me. If it weren't for my sons, I would have left this family, even if I had to beg for a living. If I hadn't come here, my father would have sold me as a concubine for a higher price. He yelled at my mother, slapping his thighs. I told you not to make that other deal while I was gone. If you'd sold her to the other people, we'd have more millet to eat, more money to spend. That was how I came here. And when I talked about it yesterday, my son scolded me. Boy, that makes me mad. I told them, you don't know how much your mother has suffered. In those days, I cried and cried until I had no more tears. I gave birth to 8 children, and I cried 8 times. At night, I found half my pillow wet. But who cared about me? Who'd even cook me a bowl of hot gruel? When I had my second son, my first baby was lying there crying all the time. I was crying day and night. I couldn't take it anymore. I thought, why should I have another? I had a hard enough time with only one, so I smothered the new baby. I pressed the quilt over him. He was very strong and struggled. I thought he was dead, but after an hour he groaned. Blood came out of his mouth and soaked the quilt before he died. Then I buried him. I killed my own baby. I had nothing to eat myself, and the other baby was crying. How could I possibly stand one more? I had to kill my own baby.
Wasn't there someone in the village who could help you?
Who'd come and take care of me? If anyone came, my old man would say I was a slut. No one dared come near this place. Did he ever treat me like a human being? Never. In all the years I've been here, I've never depended on him for a thing, I'm telling you. He never gave me anything. I waited on him all the time, and he said, I paid good money for you. Shouldn't you wait on me? Well, it kills me to wait on him. Now I'm old and I've brought up my children. I only live for my sons.
That's all over with. Things are fine now.
Of course things are fine now, but when my sons give me grief, I just can't stand it.
Oh, don't get too upset. The way they talk, well, they're your own children.
My own children. Pretty awful. Their father has bullied me all my life. Now that I'm in the hands of my children, I still have to take this? If I ran around outside all day like some women, then I might put up with this. But I never went anywhere, not even to the village store, and I still have to listen to this? Now things are the way they ought to be. Ever since Ling Chao married into the family, I've been liberated. Whenever an opera is playing, I go. I've really come up in the world. I feel like I'm in paradise. But what does my old man say? You've gotten so uppity you don't know your place anymore.
The isolation and tragedies experienced by Ling Qiao's mother-in-law are no longer common in the lives of rural Chinese women. The changes in their status over the past 30 years have been among the most dramatic in the world. But like women everywhere, their problems have no simple solution. One thing seems clear, however. Many improvements may take place in the countryside. But as long as a woman must leave her own family, marry into a man's household, and continue his family line, she will be considered a small happiness from the day she is born.